It's my pleasure to provide the introduction for our keynote speaker, the keynote address for our Contested Commodities Conference. Some might say after these remarks that, well, Richard paid me to say these kinds of things that I'm about to say. In part, it might be a little bit true because Richard is actually helping to fund this meeting, most of it, and I'm very, very grateful to him and the Olin program here at the University of Chicago Law School. Now, 1968, 40 years ago, was a very momentous year. It was marked by the assassinations of Bobby Kennedy and Dr. King. The Vietnam War was in full engagement, and Simon and Garfunkel released the original soundtrack to The Graduate, yes, which went quickly to #1 on the pop charts, and which brought Simon a Grammy for Best Original Score. Lyndon Johnson announced that he would not run for re-election. Jerwada, a doctor at the Sapporo Medical School, successfully performs Japan's first heart transplant. But it's also the year that a young man from Brooklyn, then Long Island, educated at Columbia, Oxford, and Yale, enters law teaching. It seems perfectly normal that we should reflect back 40 years to 1968 and see that it was indeed a significant year because Richard Epstein entered law teaching. Prior to joining the University of Chicago Law School faculty, he taught at the University of Southern California from 1968 to 1972. Richard is the James Parker Hall Distinguished Service Professor of Law here at the University of Chicago, where he has taught for the last 36 years. He has also been the Peter and Kirsten Bedford Senior Fellow and is actually at the Hoover Institution since 2000. He served as interim dean from February to June of 2001 here at the University of Chicago Law School. He has been a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences since 1985 and a senior fellow of the Center for Clinical Medical Ethics at the University of Chicago Medical School, also that since 1983. He served as editor of the Journal of Legal Studies from 1981 to 1991 and of the Journal of Law and Economics from 91 to 2001. At present, he is director of the John M. Olin Program in Law and Economics. His books include Antitrust Decrees in Theory and Practice, Why Less is More, Overdose, How Excessive Government Regulation Stifles Pharmaceutical Innovation, How Progressives Rewrote the Constitution, and then a host of other books, and you probably remember the Takings material, mostly, perhaps, or Mortal Peril, Our Inalienable Right to Health Care.
Question mark.
There you go. Forbidden Grounds, The Case Against Employment Discrimination Laws, published by Harvard in 1992. And I could go on. But what I most want to share is actually something that Richard said when he introduced me at a conference last year after giving a number of accolades that I actually didn't pay him for. But he concluded by saying, and she's my friend. And I want to conclude this introduction by saying, and he's my friend, Richard Epstein.
Thank you so much. Yeah, actually, I mean, it is kind of an odd story. Michele and I met through Blurb. Somebody sent me her book on organ transplant as a matter of critical race theory, and I decided, against my better judgment, to open it up. And then I said, wait a second, this is a good book. So I did the blurb, and then we met I guess at the time when I was talking out of both sides of my mouth at that conference on internet. I can't remember what it was I was speaking about. It gets very confused. And I think I'm the keynote speaker today because I'm the only person here who hasn't written a paper. And I will convert these remarks to a paper if it is necessary. And I do want to talk something about the questions about the relationships of markets, commodification, commoditization, which is the term that's used in financial markets, which has a very different kind of connotation, and the way in which we go. Now, in order to do this particular thing, it would be appropriate of me, of course, to attack all the anti-marketeers and to explain to them why it is that they don't understand the benefits of markets and exchange and so forth. But in this particular occasion, I want to start on the opposite side and to sort of attack, or at least to critique, some of the definitions of markets which are made by their supporters, to indicate why it is, I think, that they tend to lead to a set of misconceptions about how it is that markets actually operate. And when you create those misconceptions, paradoxically what you do is you make the set of institutions seem so grotesque that what you in turn do is to create a set of moralisms against markets which have real traction, which essentially slows the case down in favor of deregulation. And so I am in favor, of course, of deregulation, but it seems to me that if you're going to try to figure out how and why that things work, the first predicate for this particular situation is to have some kind of an accurate account of to what it is that you think deregulation will lead to. And I think that many of the oppositions that take place to markets, whether you're talking about labor markets and the minimum wage, or whether you're talking about organ markets, or whether you're talking about markets for adoptions and babies and so forth, come from some very hasty inferences about how these particular transactions will be organized, and that gives you a kind of visual image which is so repellent that it sort of strengthens the case for saying we dare not move otherwise. And this particular argument is in turn strengthened even further, because if you have a large culture associated with restrictions, you don't have any observed instances from which you can draw parallels. And I think we saw part of the difficulty with that with Ben Hippen. He had to leave. He said it wasn't in protest, to go downtown with Laney, is that you will start to describe something like the Iranian market as a market, when in fact it isn't an open market at all. It is covered by huge sorts of limitations associated with monopsony buyers at fixed prices, mandated intermediates, no advertisements in order to get information across, no negotiations with respect to collateral, non-price terms, and so forth. And the only prediction that you could make about that is that you're going to get a market in which if the price is artificially depressed, the quality of organs that you're going to receive is qualitatively down. And so a lot of the bad results that you see come not from the fact that it's been liberalized under these circumstances, but rather that the liberalization has been incomplete. And so therefore you don't want to start drawing inferences about the way in which a quote-unquote unregulated market would work, assuming you knew what that meant. And that phrase itself is subject to two very different definitions, which I will talk about momentarily, meaning now, as a kind of a prelude to the discussion. It turns out if you look to people on the left and you ask what they think about regulation, they define regulation as the creation of property rights, the enforcement of contracts, the creation of such things as recordation systems and statutes of frauds. And they say, there, you've been in favor of regulation since the year 1677 when the statute of frauds has taken place. Well, why is it that you're opposed to our regulation? And it seems to me that the difference between that definition and the definition that economists who are not so versed in the fine points of the law typically makes is this. The usual economist definition of regulation is anything which the state imposes which restricts entry, mandates price, or mandates conditions, and they don't care in the slightest about all of the various kinds of things which other people call regulation, i.e. the need to have recordation of deeds and so forth. And so when one says that you're against regulation, what it means, I think, to me is in a situation where you don't have natural monopoly or the creation of monopolies, what you're willing to do is to allow price, quantity, and terms to freely float, given the fact that there are large numbers of buyers and sellers on both sides of the market, and you're not against having deeds, anti-fraud statutes, or anything else of the sort. And it's only that form of regulation that one's worried about. So when one wants to say that you want to have an unregulated market, it doesn't mean, in effect, that you're going to sort of encourage fraud or you're double dealing or something of the sort. It only means that you want to worry about these price, quality, and quantity terms. So what is it that I want to say against the markets? Well, I'm going to criticize you, Deborah, right? And the reason I'm going to do that is because I agree with you, right? I mean, there's no point in criticizing somebody whom you disagree with. And I want to criticize you from a point which I don't think you will disagree with once I force it open. So let me see if I could say what it is. You start off with the definition of market as being something highly impersonal and anonymous in these situations, in which the sole function, in effect, is to match buyers with sellers, using prices as a clearing mechanism. And there's no question, if that's the way you start to think about sort of markets, what you do is you're having the competitive market of perfect equilibrium with all these anonymous sellers and all these anonymous buyers. And I think that that's a very fine place to start, but it really has, to me, something like the cosine zero transaction cost world associated with it, in which you're not worrying about information asymmetries, fictions of one sort or another. And then the question you want to ask is, can you preserve the desirable qualities of these particular markets, namely the equilibrium that you get between supply and demand, even if you start to relax some of the assumptions about the associated impersonality with the transactions in question? And I think the answer to that case is yes. And let me see if I can explain how it is that I think of markets and so forth. One of the definitions that has been given of a market is any kind of a voluntary transaction at which these price and quantity terms equilibrate. That is incorrect. That is not the definition of a market. That is the definition of a contract. The key difference between a market and a contract, quite simply, is this. The definition of a market is an organized situation in which there's a high volume of buyers and a high volume of sellers, so that you get repetitive transactions as opposed to isolated transactions, which mean, very importantly under these circumstances, that if in fact something goes wrong the first time, and you've got repeat players on both sides of this organized market, somewhere, someone along the line is going to figure this thing out, and you will start to see the way in which the terms start to move one way or another. So to give you a very famous historical advantage involving ships, which a little bit far from this conference, there's a great case in the English law called Raffles and Wicklehouse, which involved, somebody cheered, involved a situation in which somebody was buying cotton ex-bond out of Bombay, ex-Peerless, and there were two different ships of the identical name, and the captain, one guy may have thought the one and the other guy may have thought the other, and so they were buying and selling different kinds of cotton. And when they come to London, the question is whether or not when the market breaks, the buyer is under a duty to set the cotton in question. And in the end, they decide that there's no contract. Ex ante, this is in the interest of nobody. So what happens is the guys in the Liverpool cotton market, which is a market, sit down, and what they say is, we cannot allow mistakes in name to destroy voluntary transactions, and they develop a registry system so that each boat is now given a number such that the ambiguity disappears, just the way, since there are 4,372,000 Richard Epsteins in the world, we all have social security numbers which allow somebody to differentiate amongst us. And the point is, a market can do this sort of thing because typically what happens in voluntary markets is, given friction and error, they develop a series of trade associations of voluntary groups of one sort or another for whom facilitation is the dominant issue. And when they start to work these things through, you always have the serious antitrust question, is when they start to meet in order to organize the rational situation, are they going to turn around and talk about prices when they close the meeting? It's a risk that you have to run, and the law in effect tries to take that into account. But the point that I'm trying to make here is actually a little bit simpler. We don't want to use these very stripped down definitions of a market to include casual sales, one-off sales. We want to stress, in fact, the repetitive type situation, which gives us density, gives us repetition, gives us expertise, and gives us learning. And in fact, one of the reasons why markets tend to dominate is that people who do work through casual sales are in fact going to make such a high rate of error that they will tend to avoid those situations and take a price discount in order to get greater certainty and reliability with respect to their terms. So we want to figure out, therefore, that. The second thing is, when we start having an organized market, what's the way in which this market is going to look? And again, it's very important, starting from the lawyer's point of view, to recognize that a market which has repeat players does not necessarily have identical types and forms of transactions as you move across various ways. Is Narav here? Sure. Now, Narav last year wrote me a very interesting paper with respect to the organization of markets overseas, and half of it was right and half of it was wrong, as he knows, right? And I think he's acknowledged the point, but let me describe his... Well, I mean, I learned from the paper. You learn from errors as well as from correct things, but he's an expert in trying to figure out what third world markets look like. And what happens is, essentially, the third world markets can deal with one of two types of market situations at the paradigmatic extremes with all sorts of intermediate cases, and it's important to what they are. The third world markets are very good in dense network personal relationship markets. So what happens, if you even look today in the United States, you get all sorts of situations where 4 or 5 people form partnerships. These are voluntary transactions. They are certainly regulated by certain kinds of rules. One would, I think, want to call these things certainly market-type transactions in some sense, even though they're not anonymous exchanges. And then what you do is you look at these kinds of contracts, and what you discover from Roman times forward is that they're always skeletal and always incomplete. And the skeleton with respect to these markets says, oh, we're starting in a market transaction. You're going to do this, I'm going to do that, you're going to put this much capital in, I'm going to put that much capital in, and this is how we're going to divide the proceeds when we make some kind of profit. And that is essentially enough to make this thing into a partnership. But you can figure out by virtue of the initial agreement exactly who is going to pick up what phone call on what day, who's going to go to the airport, who's going to take out the garbage, who's going to yell when some client comes in and screams and all the rest of that stuff, because this is all handled by what we call good faith. And the definition of good faith in this area is not some mushy, muddy, miserable concept that is utterly without use. It actually has a precise economic definition. The definition of good faith in these sort of open-ended or relational contracts is each partner at each particular transaction is obliged to act to the extent that he or she can do so in a way that he would act as if he internalized all the costs and all the benefits. So that essentially what happens is good faith is the legal concept which is designed to deal 2,000 years before the notion was discovered with the agency cost problem, with the conflict of interest problem, which arises in any kind of association. And if you start thinking about that as a kind of equilibrium position, that is a relational contract having a structural portion on the one hand and then having this wildly mushy kind of stuff within it subject to this kind of constraint, the most important feature of these sorts of contracts is not what they say in many cases, it's whom you make them with. So that what you teach students when you're starting to talk about the formation of a law firm or a small business, or for example a marriage, which as everyone knows is a contract of barter, services in exchange for services, with a money consideration called the price used as boot, that is extra cash from time to time in the form of a dowry and so forth. What happens is in a marriage, it's not an anonymous transaction. Who you marry actually makes a difference. And in a partnership, when people start thinking about it, they kind of say like you're married to your partner. And what they really mean by that is that you've got to have these good faith relationships, because once you're in this sort of partnership, there is a bilateral monopoly kind of problem. Each can welch on the other. And the way in which you try to control that is in effect through the selection mechanism, the observation mechanism, third-party bonding mechanism. If you're a partner with somebody and your dad happens to play with his dad at the country club, got an extra little hook if he's going to go bad and vice versa. And as my friend Dennis Carlton always told me, he says, Sadie says that when you go to the baker, tell him Sadie sent you. And all the standard economists say, that's completely irrelevant in these anonymous markets. Well, everybody does it, and well, why is it? Because when you say Sadie sent me, he realizes you're not a first customer. He cheats you, he's cheating Sadie. He's treating Sadie, he's treating half of Chicago or Beverly Hills. He's not going to do it. So essentially what you're creating are informal bonding markets to handle these informational devices. And the important thing to understand is the people who do this do not know the formal theory. They just know it works and the kind of a feedback mechanism. So all of these contracts have this. And so then the question about these contracts, well, they're good. How good are they? Well, for small numbers and discretionary tasks, they really work rather well. And kind of go. But then you start thinking about what's the problems. Well, they're high transactions cost kind of operations because you have all these sorts of informal monitoring and so forth. And the other thing is that there are dramatic consequences with respect to scale and assignability, both of which make them very limited in terms of the utility. And on the scale side, you can't play this game with a huge partnership. And one of the reasons why service partnerships like big law firms start to look like real firms with real contracts and things is that all this discretion stuff doesn't do any good anymore. And you've got to have much more powerful rules. And when you try to make them into public corporations, all the good people leave and it tends to fail because the service stuff is just very hard to handle. So you can't expand this thing in a particular way. It's also terrifically difficult to get out of one of these things and get somebody else in because the new person has to have the trust of everybody else. So intergenerational transfers, illnesses, expansion, specialty arrangement, this is really very, very hard. And the reason you tend to do these transactions is you're willing to bear those costs because you can't think of a way to commoditize the particular transactions in question. What happens is commodity in this particular sense is a good thing that you're aspiring to Because if you could commoditize a relationship, then you could start using much more anonymous kinds of things, which Deborah was talking about, for which the world is in fact a much happier and a better place. Well, now how does that start to work? Well, in order to get yourself into a commoditized situation, you now have to have strong systems of property rights. They have to be able to be worked essentially anonymously, and that's going to require the enforcement of the state. And so essentially when you're looking at the way in which voluntary markets organize themselves, at the extremes you get these ATM credit card types of transactions in which the last thing you want to do is to put the card into the credit card and it comes back and it says, "Did you have indigestion this morning?" And what you do is you turn around, you put it in the machine, and you said, "Yes." "Did you take Milox this morning?" You put in no. "We can't give you more than $50 today, right, out of your own money." Nobody wants this. Essentially, the essence is exactly the opposite situation. You want large networks, you want open inclusions, you want anonymous transactions, and your job is to maximize velocity and reliability in a way in which you cannot do through the personal trust kind of model. And so what happens is if you're trying to figure out what markets are, what you discover is that there's a strong kind of sorting mechanism that starts to take place between those things which could be multiple small repetitive events subject to these precise things for which the standard economic models work rather well. And then there are these relational contracts on the other side, for which that particular model makes absolutely no sense at all because it doesn't describe in any way, shape, or form the way in which anybody starts to do things. Now, this is a conference which is dealing about contestable commodities, and everybody's worried about commodification. And there's a reason to be worried about it, because that's already inherent in the model of private transactions, independent of the theory of public discussion. And what I said before, of course, is with these private arrangements, free alienability isn't going to work. I'm married to my wife, and she says, "You know what? I want out of this relationship. Kim will be your wife today." It's great. I like it. Free exchange, substitutability, it's got the whole thing working for it. I didn't ask you, Kim, but you get the point that it's somehow or other you can't run these things in that, and you can't treat the substability as commodities. And the point about this is you can't commoditize these kinds of relationships no matter what the law is going to tell you, no matter how it is. There's just too much of these sort of private hooks that pull people together that the substitutions, in effect, always have to be, to use the old term, those of novation, in which essentially if you're going to substitute in somebody for somebody else, you have to get the consent of all three parties. You can't allow these things to be freely alienable in bilateral transactions, knowing that the obligations and benefits to the third parties ride through without going up or down. So all these things are kind of hard. And then when you start to say, okay, we've now got this distinction, where do we start to put these kinds of kidney transactions? Where do we put the adoption market and so forth in this particular arrangement? And it turns out it fits very uncomfortably into the sort of dichotomous arrangement that we're talking about. On the one hand, what people have said, and they said, I think, exactly correctly, I think Laney said it this morning, it was the one thing I agreed with, if you're a player in the kidney market, you can play this game once, but you can't play it twice, right? And so what happens is you don't have the ongoing, constant experiential interactions with somebody else. What you have to do is, by definition, is make this thing into an exchange or a transfer relationship rather than an ongoing relationship. And one of the reasons why we know that UNOS is destined to crater, right, even before it starts, is it picked a name which represents this kind of socialist jalopy view of the world, United Network for Organ Sharing. And that's the model. Well, I got this extra kidney, and you get it on Monday, and you get it on Tuesday, and Rob, it's yours on Wednesday, but you got to make sure it's good, and you give it to Ray on Thursday, right? And it goes round, and it rocks out. All you can do and share is you can give it to A or to B or to C or to D, and you're doing an allocation system, you're not doing a sharing system. And the moment you start to call it a sharing system, what happens is you bias the inquiry into thinking that there's some really strong collective role that is necessary in a process for which the collective intervention under a system like UNIS has been nothing short of ignorant and catastrophic. I hope you're taping this, because I want them to hear it. And I think that one kind of understands that is the problem. So you can't kind of, in these particular situations, you can't treat this as a relationship in the long term. And so now you got to treat it as a spot transaction. This is not like selling a newspaper. And this, I think, is the key point that one has to work. In voluntary markets, which are run by real people, you use different methods for exchange, for the different kinds of commodities and or services that are going to be exchanged at any given point in time. You just don't have the same rule. And so, for example, let's think of it in this way to see just how absurd it would be to assume the parallel. You go into a supermarket and you go into one places and you start seeing, red meat, sirloin steaks for sale. And they're all wrapped up and they're put into package. You pick one up and put it into the bag. Non-discretionary price at the register. Then you're going to have kidneys. They could be the same thing if they're meant to being eaten. And then you go into the third conversation. Kidneys for transplantation. We put them right in there, and you can pick one of those up, right, and put it into the basket and pay for it in the same way. You're not going to transfer kidneys in that particular fashion. It's not going to work. You want to take another example of things that are not going to work? Psychiatric services is a perfect illustration. There is absolutely no requirement that I'm aware of in the general law which says that the provision of psychiatric services have to be provided in the same way as other sorts of services. And you go and you look at the health service at the University of Chicago, and I dare say at every other institution, including Barnard, and what happens is somebody comes and have serious psychiatric problems. The last thing they want to do is to sit in a room with 20 of their students, go into an office marked psychiatric, and have everybody else watch them and cheer them on as they talk about their dementia, depression, and oppressive parents. Well, what do? What you say is, look, this is a privacy interest that really matters. They're not going to come unless you give them some degree of profession. So what you do is you arrange for them to be paid and to go to multiple off-site arrangements, each of which has its own mechanisms to ensure privacy, precisely because the nature of this service is sufficiently sensitive that people don't want to have it through the ordinary mechanisms. And markets, if they're working at all, will understand this, and instead of having the anonymous rapid transfer, you develop this kind of middle category in which you have one-shot or short period transactions which have much of the discretion that's associated with the kind of partnership sort of arrangement, but nonetheless has to be able to handle all the commercialization issues that are associated with the sale arrangement. And so when you're trying to figure out how these markets are going to operate, the key feature that you have to make in every case that you deal with is quite simply this. If you deregulate it, what sort of intermediaries, what sort of arrangements, what sort of structures are going to be developed as you start to put these things forward? Let's start with the baby market. And it was interesting. What happened is we had a lot of discussions about this, and it's clear that there is to some extent a market in babies, although it is not a completely unregulated market, even in the economist sense, because there's no cash price that can be transferred back and forth. But on the other hand, if you look at these kinds of markets, you can certainly pay a woman donor. What you can do is you could pick up the cost of all of her obstetrical and medical expenses, hospitalization, and so forth, so that instead of having a $15,000 bill when she gives birth to the child, essentially her accounts is zeroed out for the benefit of her child, and for anybody else. And this is certainly going to have some kind of an inducement to be willing to part with children, because you now get a tangible benefit. And so now, in effect, you'd ask yourself, the question is, if we completely uncap that, and what we did is we allowed the price to go up to market, what would we expect to happen? And if somebody were, I think, sufficiently unschooled in economics, they'd say, this is a perfect Chicago situation. We'll just put this kid up to bed. Do I hear 20? Do I hear 25? Do I hear $30,000, $40,000 for this child? And not only that, I have even a better market than baby selling. My dream market as a pure Chicago economist is the baby mortgaging market, right? And so what you do is you go and say, well, I got to borrow $100,000. Can I give you a little saving? You hold that when I pay it back. You return it. Treat the kid. You don't see anybody advocating a baby mortgaging market because we know the moral hazard to the child. And in fact, here is a perfectly confident prediction, which is you remove all price constraints, you might get some kind of bid for positive money. But think of the other institutions which actually take place. First of all, there are always learned intermediaries of one sort or another in every one of these baby markets that are done privately. And the private intermediaries are always better than the public intermediaries in what they ask and what they demand. And so one of my sisters-in-law actually went through all this process many years ago, and she and her husband, they had to prepare resumes. What they would do, how they would go. They had to show it to the birth mother. Then they had to go in for interviews. They had to maybe give a little bit of stuff about psychiatric testing. They had to tell something about income, something about where the child was going to be. And what was going on is, when I mentioned the interdependent utilities earlier between the parent and the child, this mother actually cares about the child, which is going to go off somewhere, so she's not a price maximizer. And the moment she's not a price maximizer, she's not going to take a bid independent of the quality of the life that she expects the child to have. And in fact, you would expect her to take a very stiff discount under these circumstances. And in effect, think of it this way. If you care about your child, and you can put it into one family where you know it's going to get everything up to private school, college education, love and care and so forth, present value of that, $300,000. And you have the standard 2-to-1 ratio, you're really going to take 15 grand from somebody who's going to only put $50,000 into that child? You'd have to be crazy. You can't multiply if you're doing that. So you look at the way in which these markets operate, it turns out that the restraints that you want against commodification, that dirty word, are intrinsic to the market itself. Now the question is, can you do better through state regulation than you can through working through these doctor networks, broker networks, Yenta networks, which are very important in this market? And so, well, you could try state adoption agencies. And they have it. They have wonderful rules. First question they ask, are the parents over 35? In some cases. Oh, you can't adopt if you're over 35. Everyone knows you're too infirm. And I agree with that. I had one child when I was 38 and the other one when I was 41, and I was too infirm. So you take the kids away from me, right? So that's, wait a second, that can't be right. I mean, people over 35 may not be as vigorous, but they get higher nannies and other help in this. I don't know. Mary, where are you, Mary Ann? You're not here. She had to leave because this is not quite the prostitution market, but whatever it is, it's a market that takes place. And of course, they don't take this stuff into account in the formal agencies. Then you have to have every kid have a separate bedroom. In New York City, wait a second, the parents don't have a separate bedroom, right? Well, you know this, they get all the wrong metrics. And so the question you want to ask is, once you understand how these sort of mixed transfer relational markets operate, the model of the ATM machine simply is going to be rejected by forces internal to the market rather than otherwise, because now the market is not some amorphous agency like the adoption agency. The market is the combined preferences of lots of different individuals who have lots of things going on, and what markets cannot avoid is taking into account the subjective elements, and as those elements start to become more important, the model of the anonymous exchange, which Deborah referred to at the beginning of her paper, is a model which does not happen. You start working at the kidney market, right? And it turns out, it's not really all that different in many ways if you ever let it to be deregulated. I mean, Laney's story today was the horror story. Everybody's going to go out there and buy the kidney from the lowest price seller. Well, wait a second. I think I know how markets work. And what you're doing is, if you're a buyer of a good, you are always more particular about what you're getting than somebody who's a seller who's only getting price. And in the kidney situation, to be quite technical about it, everybody here turns out to be a buyer. Because what happens is the, quote, seller of the kidney is somebody who has to buy medical care, because even if the world is not concerned with the long-term health, the psychological, social effects on this thing, most of these people will start to be concerned with the way they operate. And on the buyer side, it's not only a price that you're concerned with, it's also a quality of the organ that you're going to give. And so the model which says that you'd always bid down the kidney and take that of the lowest person is a model which says if you're dealing with automobiles, you'll go to the used car lot and say, show me the cheapest car on the lot and I'll take it sight unseen. And sure enough, in that market, the only thing that gets sold is jalopies. But we see everything from Impalas up the line to Jaguars and so forth, because what happens is buyers are always dealing with pairs, price-quality pairs. And the equilibrium market in this thing will in fact be exactly something that reflects that situation, particularly if you have enough learning and enough reportage and everything else that you can't do it. So what happens then? You need that second thing. If you're dealing with one-spot transactions like the baby market, you gotta have intermediaries. You just can't do without them. People buy houses. Nobody says about the brokers is what these guys do is they're just instruments for fraud. What everybody says about a broker is there's an agency cost conflict of interest that you have to take into account, reputation, sort of going back to the client for certain kinds of biddings, all sorts of other ways are designed to deal with that. You minimize the sum of the conflict of interest. All right, and the other kinds of costs of the salary, and then you set that off against the better knowledge that you get of the market by working through various kinds of brokers. So my friend Art Mattis, he's in favor of a regulated kidney market. He's in favor of banning brokers. This seems to me to be suicidally wrong. If, in fact, the matching function and the educative function are really extremely important, what you want to do is to have large numbers of people come in there. It doesn't even mean that you get only one guy. I mean, I know my daughter recently gave birth. I don't know all the people she has, but she hired a doula, right? There's somebody to watch after her inside the hospital. There's a conflict of interest between her and the doula. There always is. Somehow or other, she thought it was a pretty good experience. So what you really have to do in these markets is to ask yourself, not just the price and quantity term. That will give you the completely wrong impression of how kidney markets work, or any other market do. What you have to do is to imagine the set of collateral and support institutions which will start to arise in the way in which things work to figure out what the exchange mechanism is. Now, I'm just about running out of time, so I just only want to mention one other point, which is in talking about this, I've deliberately put aside something which in some cases will matter, which is external effects with respect to the voluntary arrangements on third parties. And I think in that point, Deborah's pretty right. I mean, these are not the dominant constraints. But in certain things like complicated race markets and gender balance markets issues and so forth, it may well be an issue. And if so, what you generally want to do is to have that form of regulation which achieves the external objective on which there's wide social agreement with minimum disruption of the voluntary exchange mechanism that is otherwise available. But what happens unnoted, you get this one crank who could never maintain this market. He goes before Congress, and Senator Gore, or Representative Gore at the time, with his unerringly bad instincts on this thing, said, we better shut down the whole thing. Because the implicit model that he had, and it's the model against which I wish to warn you, was a model, if we deregulated the market, this guy would be the only game in town. Thank you. I'm done.